Well, good afternoon on this absolutely glorious Tuesday afternoon. I'm sitting here positively glowing, but I do not wish this weather away. And I have to digress because me saying I'm positively glowing reminds me of a story, a real true story. When I was about 12 or 13, some friend of mine, her name was Penelope Skilton. Her mother offered me a lift home. It was a really hot afternoon and we'd got our satchels on our backs, and Penny had travelled from Northwood, I'd travelled from Watford. We joined on the same train and we got in the car and I sat in the back seat and I went, God, blimey, I'm sweating. To which Mrs. Skilton turned round to me and she said, Merit, horses sweat, men perspire, and ladies glow. So I stood corrected, so I've been glowing ever since. Anyway, that's not what I'm here to talk to you about. I have just finished doing all my work and I thought to myself, I am going to promote my book. I'm always promoting my talks. I take you to the apiary, I talk about my talks, but I so rarely talk about my books, so I thought I would read you a chapter from the first book, Betsie Valentine and the Honeybees. I forgot the title of it then, Betsie Valentine and the Honeybees, which is a magical adventure about a spirited young girl called Betsie Valentine who takes off and learns all about the secret life of the honeybees inside and outside of a hive. So I'm going to read from chapter 5. It's called Are You Looking at Me, Little Bee? And it's the only part of the book where I had to use fantasy, because somehow for Betsie to learn all about them truly, she had to turn into a honeybee herself. And this is where it all starts. She's just gone outside with a honey sandwich for her lunch, and before she leaves, because she's got honey, her mother says, be careful before you take a bite, Betsie, because look out for bees or wasps. Now, honeybees will not come to your table. It will be the wasps, unless you've got honey. And then they probably will come. They'll take the honey and then they'll go. Unlike the wasp, they won't sting you on the way out. Anyway, here we go. I've got to put my glasses on because these are lensed and they're very focals. Happens to us all at some point. So, chapter 5, Are You Looking at Me, Little Bee? There weren't any bees or wasps to be seen, so Betsie popped a triangle of bread and sticky honey into her mouth. She took her beaker from the table and sat back in the chair and looked over the rim at the remaining 3 sandwiches. Well, I never, she said very quietly, not moving a muscle. There, seemingly appearing from nowhere, a honeybee was standing as bold as brass on top of one of her sandwiches, and what is more, it appeared to be looking straight at her. Very gently, Betsie leaned forward and put her beaker back on the table. She didn't take her eyes away from the bee for a single second. She stayed absolutely still and watched it for a moment or two longer. As she looked at the bee, she thought of Huey in his yellow and brown hooped pyjamas and smiled as she said in the gentlest of voices, Are you looking at me, little bee? The bee stared at Betsie, so she asked again, Are you looking at me, little bee? And very gently she began to lean back in the chair. The bee took a couple of steps backwards on the sandwich. Betsie, a little startled, sat back a tiny bit more. The bee, she was now convinced, was staring straight back at her. You are looking at me, little bee, said Betsie in a controlled but very excited voice. Very gently she placed the fingertips of both hands on the edge of the table and raised one finger in the air and kept very still. The bee lifted one of its front legs up and it too stayed very still. Betsie's eyes nearly popped out of her head and her jaw dropped. Goodness, she said, and she lowered her finger back on the table, and the bee lowered its leg. Well, I'll be, she said, not believing her eyes. You are copying me. The bee turned in a circle and then made its way down the side of the sandwich to a little pool of honey that had trickled out of the side of the bread. It took a drink from the honey and returned to the top of the sandwich and walked around in another circle. As Betsie sat with her eyes fixed on the bee, she began to make up a rhyme in her head. The bee stopped and looked at her again, so Betsie said the rhyme out loud. Are you looking at me, little bee? Are you looking at me? My name is Betsie Valentine, and that begins with a B. Resting her hands in her lap, she went on. Are you looking at me, little bee? Are you looking at me? My name is Betsie Valentine, and I'd love to be a bee. The bee buzzed its wings and flew up into the air and hovered a little way above the sandwich and then slowly came back down again. Betsie opened her eyes really wide, and the bee did it again. Betsie scratched her head, and the bee lifted one of its legs and appeared to touch its head. With her mouth wide open in amazement, Betsie drew in a big breath of air, touched her head with the other hand, and the bee did exactly the same with its other leg. Up went the bee again, and back down it came. Betsie was sure, as sure could be, that this little honeybee, standing in front of her on her honey sandwich, was just as excited as she was. Betsie sat back in the chair and closed her eyes for a brief moment, thinking about what she had just seen, and from out of nowhere she heard a little voice say, Betsie Valentine, do you really want to be a bee? So that's the start of her turning into a honeybee. You'll have to buy the book and read chapter 6 to see what happens next. But actually, that little incident was based on a true story of mine, which inspired me to write the book. I was inspecting the bees, and a little bee landed on my cuff, which is what they do, but she seemed to look at me. And I looked at her, and I said, are you looking at me, little bee? And she just stood there. She didn't fly off. She didn't do anything. Nothing unusual about that. So I carried on with the inspection, and when I looked, she was still there. So I asked her again, are you looking at me, little bee? And then this wonderful rhyme came into my head that said, my name is Betsie Valentine, and that begins with a B. And when I said it out loud, this little bee literally jumped in a circle and landed back down again. And I thought, I'm going to write a book, and I'm going to call it Betsie Valentine and the Honeybees. And that's where this book started. It's available on my website. The details are up above me here, mdthequeenbee.co.uk. It's a wonderful time of year to buy this book and introduce it to your children to learn all about the honeybees. They'll love Betsie, they'll love the little friend she makes, Honey, and by the end of the book, they'll love the honeybees too, and they won't be running away from them, they'll be going out looking for them. So, as I always say, what are you waiting for?